Hello, sports journalism students. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about how to write headlines. And just as a heads up, some of the examples that I use in this presentation in terms of screenshots are from last year. I intended, before I showed it to you all, to update it with newer, more recent headlines involving sports, but there are no more sports. And so I've just left the old ones in there because that seemed like the right thing to do. I hope you don't mind. Okay, let's chat about headlines. And please don't forget, this week's practice assignment is to put headlines on those 5 stories I took the headlines off of that I emailed out to you all earlier. Now, one of the reasons we're going to talk about headlines is because increasingly, sports reporters are expected to write their own headlines. When there are cuts at news websites and newspapers and even television stations on the writing side of things on their websites, when there's cuts to the budget, it's usually the dedicated sports copy editors that end up taking the cut and going. There may be a dedicated copy desk for reading copy in the news side of things, but sports is lucky if they can get their own copy editors. So the writers are expected to put their own headlines on their own stories. Just as a quick warning though, before we get too much into this, I do want to make sure that I specify the differences between headlines and art headlines, or art heads as they are sometimes called. A headline has a subject and a verb, and it sums up what the story or the analysis column is going to be about. It's descriptive in nature. It tells somebody what they're about to read when they click on the story or when they see it on the page. So for example, this headline, Clippers are the freshest, best thing in the NBA playoffs. In this case, subject and verb. The subject would be Clippers and the verb are. Now there's a little bit of a problem with the verb are, but we'll handle that later on in this video. Or Tebow won't cheat on getting better, comma, diet. We'll talk about what that comma means in a little bit, but for now, the subject and verb is Tebow won't, which is a contraction of will not. Or memorable April in Augusta could boost golf's future. At this point, the subject would be April and the verb is could. Everything else is just dressing. Everything else is just the words needed to give the subject and the verb clarity and make them make sense in context. But you have to have at least one subject and at least one verb. Art headlines are often single words, catchy phrases, or puns, and they're designed usually using special fonts or other sort of graphic design layers to them, and they're usually at the top of the page in much bigger letters. And so a couple of examples of this from last year was when the Tampa Bay Lightning, the NHL team, did very well throughout their regular season, had a record-breaking year, and then completely fell apart in the finals. And so one of the art heads on the top of the content here from the Tampa Bay Times is Fizzlesticks, which, hey, there you go. That's a pun. Notice not a subject and verb, it's just a word. Or the other one, which is floored. And if you'll notice with this one, floored is acting as the art head, but the thing beneath it is got sort of a little bit of a description to it, almost like it was a full headline. We call those a subhead. So the thing beneath the art headline we would call a subhead. And in this case, it says, add this to the Lightning's historic year, swept out of the playoffs in the first round. Boo. I think I said finals a second ago. Sorry for misspeaking. It's been a whole year since I've watched any of this occur. And I really like the book, how it sums this up. It says headlines are ads that sell stories to potential readers by promising a benefit for reading the story. So there you go. You are selling the story that you have written to the readers and trying to convince them to buy the product, which in this case means click on your story and read it. Headline writing online takes a whole nother level of importance because of a thing called SEO. SEO stands for search engine optimization. Now, back in the day, what this meant was when websites like Yahoo or early Google would gather content for their search engine to gather the stuff that would show up when you would put a search term in, they would have these little robots that go and crawl around the internet and gather search terms from certain content, and they would put the stuff that matches that content higher. That's not really how any of it works anymore, but SEO still matters because of two big reasons. One of which is Google News and other news aggregation sites. You want to make sure that your story is the one that stands out on the list of stories on that same topic if someone was to go to Google News and try to find a story on that topic. The other one is social media. When you are posting your content to a website and then transferring it over to something like Twitter or to Facebook, you want to make sure you have the headline that gets the most people reading it, because the more they read it, the more likely they are to retweet it or to share it. And so you can get those numbers going up and up. Also, just research has shown us when they do eyeball tracking software research that people's eyeballs go to the headline first. They don't go to really anything else on the page other than the image that corresponds with it and the headline. So one of the secrets to good headline writing in sports is including full names. And what that means in sports is full names of teams, full names of mascots, and full names of players and coaches. So it could be that if you're talking about Georgia Southern, you don't want to just say Georgia Southern. You want to say the Georgia Southern University Women's Basketball Eagles or the Men's Basketball Eagles. Full name of team, full name of university, full name of mascot. In that case, when you do that, you're pinging more things that will show up and make it more likely that your story will be listed higher up on the list of aggregation sites that people tend to use, and especially use with sports. In sports writing, especially, more than 90% of the headlines will begin with the name of a team, a mascot, a player, or a coach, and that's totally fine. That is totally acceptable to do because sports are built around those concepts. So let's talk about some basic rules for writing good sports headlines. A headline has got to have both a subject and a verb. This is not unique to sports, but it's especially important with sports to have both a subject and a verb. So if this is our headline, FSU hammers Arizona State, then the subject is FSU and the verb is hammers. So it is subject, verb. If you ever feel stuck, just try to think of what your one-word subject is and your one-word verb is, and then fill everything else in around that. Or if, as an example, rain washes out cup practice, comma, jumbles schedule. In this case, rain would be the subject and washes would be the verb. And everything else after that is just giving more life to the headline, but you have at least a subject and a verb to work around. Also note that we don't really need periods, we don't use exclamation points, or when we do choose to use exclamation points, it is very sparingly, and it is only when it is a really big deal. It is a huge thing. Like usually we save this for Super Bowl wins. And question marks in headlines should be used very sparingly and only in columns where, as a columnist, you are asking a question that you want your audience to consider. Don't just use a question mark headline willy-nilly. So from the Cape Cod Times, this is from a previous Super Bowl, 2017's Super Bowl, with believable with the exclamation point. In this case, if the team you're covering wins the Super Bowl, yeah, use an exclamation point. Or at last, exclamation point, from when the Philadelphia Eagles finally won a Super Bowl. In which case, yeah, at that point, feel free to use an exclamation point. We do want to avoid that question mark headline if it can be answered with a yes or no. So I already said you can use a question mark headline only on an analysis column and only when that analysis column is bringing up a question. But to add an extra rule to it, it should not be a question mark headline that can be answered with yes or no. Reserve it for hypotheticals or unknowns. So something like anatomy of a playoff collapse. What happened to the Lightning? Question mark. The point of this story is to bring up all the questions of what in the world went wrong with this team, this legendarily good team from this period that failed in the playoffs. So a question mark works, right? And you can't answer that yes, no. What happened to the Lightning? Yes. What happened to the Lightning? No, that doesn't work. It's a hypothetical question. Who is James Adducci, the $1.2 million winner who bet on Tiger Woods? This is a fun little feature story from last year about the guy who ended up winning a whole bunch of money because he was one of the few people to bet on Tiger Woods winning the Masters. So the whole point of the story is that it's about this guy. So the idea of the question, well, who is he, works. That works fine. You can't answer it yes or no. Use conversational language in a casual way as long as your story is not super serious. It's one of the nice things we have about sports writing is that we don't have to take everything super serious all the time. And so don't phrase stuff in a very pinkies out sort of fancy way, right? Like quad of equestrian, flay, flanks, and battle for pigskin is a terrible headline. Anytime you see a headline on the screen with the little red no sign on the top right, that means that's a bad headline. So instead, we would say something like 4 horsemen of Notre Dame trot across the goal line. That's much better, much more simple. Use present tense for past and present tense events. So unlike your written recaps, unlike the body copy of the story, where you are going to use past tense for default tense because your story has already happened, the game is already done by the time you write it, headlines stay present tense. That's just journalistic tradition. So UF chomped Michigan in Peach Bowl. That would be a no because chomped as the verb in the subject verb headline is in past tense here, which is not what we want. Instead, it should be UF chomps with an S to make it present tense, Michigan in Peach Bowl. Much better. You want to use as actiony of an action verb as possible because it is sports, and sports are driven by the concept of action and motion and things happening. So instead of a headline that says Hamilton in lead for points total, it's kind of dull. We could say Hamilton grabs lead for points total because grab is a much more actiony verb. It is a much more exciting verb to pay attention to. Consider what verbs connect to what you're writing about. So think about how you can connect verbs in a way that makes sense for what you're writing about in almost a punny way. I'm not telling you to use puns because puns are often terrible, but I'm just telling you to consider something like Wildcats pounce on depleted Tigers. If it is a mascot, if the team name is Wildcats, you can think about what verb does a wildcat do? Well, it pounces on things to eat it. So there you go. Or Eagles soar over Eastern Michigan in final seconds. What a fun headline that is. What does an eagle do? It soars. So use flight style verbs to get your point across and to make it that much more entertaining. Remember, the point of the headline is to sell the reader on the idea of reading the content that you have made. So please try to make it as actiony as verb and as fun of verbs as you can. You want to bench any of your articles, just get rid of them. You don't need articles for the most part in a headline. So instead of saying Olympic runner carries the torch, comma, lights flame, that's not great. You want to say Olympic runner carries torch, comma, lights flame. What this means is that you are allowed to substitute ands with a comma in headlines as well. So you can say runners from Kenya and Australia qualify for semifinals, but that and isn't really doing a whole lot there as a conjunction. And so you would say runners from Kenya, comma, Australia qualify for semifinals. All that means is in a headline, you can use a comma in substitute of the word and. I haven't mentioned this and I haven't put this in a slide now that I think about it, but you can also use a colon to indicate that someone has said something. Omit any to be verbs. And you may be asking yourself, what is a to be verb? The most common to be verb we're going to find in headline writing is are, A-R-E. So instead of saying Summer Olympics are headed to Tokyo, say Summer Olympics headed to Tokyo. We don't need the are there. It is redundant. We can just instead use a different verb in place of the to be. And we do that by dropping it out completely. And use the infinitive form of verbs for their future tense. So instead of saying Smith will receive Hall of Fame honor, you want to say Smith to receive Hall of Fame honor. Okay, so that is the quick lesson on headlines. Now, what I sent out to you earlier this week is 5 stories that I pulled from USA Today. Please don't cheat and go look up what their headline was. That's not fun. Instead, what I want you to do is take those 5 stories, read them, put your own headlines on them, and submit them for a grade. I've actually just got a text box set up in the Dropbox on the practice section of the Folio site. So what I want you to do is just type out your headlines, and headline 1, and then headline 2, headline 3, headline. But you won't know what to headline the stories unless you read them. So please read them and then type out your headlines and submit them that way. And so with that, I will see you all in a little bit, where we will talk a little bit more about the idea of, let's see, what are we going to talk about? Keeping sources, as well as the idea, we're going to cover a little bit of beat reporting as well in the next week. Also, if you have not already, please do me a favor and submit your NFL draft picks so that we can I can start tabulating those together into one document so I can score it better and see who's going to get those great extra credit points. So with that, I will see y'all later.